Have you ever sat quietly, maybe with a cup of coffee cooling in your hands, and wondered, why, even with a full life, does your heart sometimes feel so empty? Why is it that after 50, when we are supposed to feel accomplished, secure, and wise, we often find ourselves staring out the window, longing for something we can't even name? You are not alone in this feeling. And the good news is, the emptiness you feel is not a sign that you have failed. It's a quiet invitation to come home to yourself, to awaken to a life beyond achievement, beyond loss, beyond the noise of the world. Today we are going to walk through a story, a reflection, and some gentle Buddhist wisdom that will help you understand this emptiness not as a curse, but as a doorway. Together, we will explore how to soften around the ache in your chest, how to welcome both joy and sorrow, and how to begin again, not by becoming someone new, but by returning to who you have always been. So sit back, breathe, and let's take this journey together. Have you ever sat alone in your living room after a long day, the TV still playing in the background, but suddenly realizing you can't remember what you were watching? You glance at your phone. No new messages. You look around your house. Everything is in its place. The kids are grown. The career is winding down or has already ended. There's food in the fridge. There's money in the bank. And yet, something inside feels hollow, like a quiet ache you can't explain. Emily Harris knew this feeling all too well. At 52, Emily had what many would call a good life. She had raised 2 children, built a successful career in education, and been married for nearly 30 years. Her house in the suburbs of Ohio was filled with family photos, souvenirs from vacations, and the soft hum of a life well lived. And yet, on many evenings, Emily would find herself sitting by the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, staring at the fading light with a heaviness she couldn't shake. She would ask herself, why do I still feel empty? It wasn't depression, at least not the kind that needed medication. It wasn't a lack of gratitude. Emily was thankful for her health, her family, her home. It wasn't even boredom. She had hobbies, friends, and volunteer work. But there was something deeper, something quieter that lingered just beneath the surface of her days. Buddhist wisdom has a name for this ache. It's called dukkha, often translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. But the word doesn't just refer to dramatic pain or heartbreak. It points to the subtle dissatisfaction that runs through all of life. The way even good moments slip away, the way joy is tinged with the fear of losing it, the way our hearts keep searching even when we have so much. Emily was beginning to feel what the Buddha taught thousands of years ago, that no external achievement, no relationship, no possession can permanently satisfy the longing inside. She was touching the human condition itself. And in this way, her emptiness was not a failure, but a doorway. But no one had ever told her that. For months, Emily tried to fill the ache. She joined a yoga class. She went on weekend trips. She redecorated the guest bedroom. She even got a puppy. And for a while, each of these things brought a spark of joy, a burst of color into her life. But as the weeks went by, the same feeling returned, like an old friend sitting across the table. Silent, patient, waiting. One afternoon, after another restless night, Emily wandered into a local bookstore and stumbled across a book with a soft blue cover and gold letters. The Heart of Buddhist Wisdom. She wasn't sure why she picked it up. Maybe it was the quiet simplicity of the title, or maybe it was the sense that the answers she was looking for weren't in another project, but in a deeper place. That night, she read late into the evening, and for the first time in months, she felt seen. The book spoke of the impermanence of all things, how everything we love, everything we fear, everything we hold on to will eventually change, fade, or disappear. It spoke of the way we chase happiness in things that are, by their nature, fleeting. And it spoke of another way, the path of turning inward, of meeting life with awareness, of finding peace, not by adding more, but by letting go. Emily closed the book and sat very still. She listened to the sound of her own breath. She looked around her living room, not as a backdrop to her anxiety, but as it was, the fading light, the ticking clock, the dog curled up in a chair. And in that moment, something softened. The ache didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became less of an enemy and more of a companion, whispering, "Here is your chance to wake up." Buddhist teachings remind us that emptiness is not a mistake. It's a signal. It's the universe inviting us to step off the treadmill of doing and into the practice of being. But here's the hard truth. Most of us will spend years, even decades, running from that invitation. We run by keeping busy. We run by seeking applause. We run by accumulating more money, more success, more attention. But as Buddhist wisdom teaches, the more we chase, the more the emptiness grows, because it's not asking to be filled. It's asking to be felt. Emily began to understand this slowly. The next morning, instead of rushing to check her phone or fill her calendar, she sat by the window with her tea, just watching the world wake up. She let the ache be there. She let the questions be there. She began to see that this space inside her wasn't a problem to solve. It was a door to something deeper. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." Emily wrote those words on a sticky note and placed it on her bathroom mirror. Each morning she read them as she brushed her teeth. A small reminder that the life she was looking for wasn't somewhere out there. It was right here, waiting inside her. And maybe you have felt it too. Maybe you've reached a point in life where the old stories don't fit anymore. Maybe you've achieved things you once thought would complete you, only to find yourself restless again. Maybe you look around and think, is this it? And if so, I want to tell you, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not broken. What if that emptiness isn't a sign of failure, but a sign of awakening? What if the ache in your heart is the beginning of a new chapter, one not built on doing more, but on becoming more present, more alive, more compassionate? Buddhist wisdom invites us to stop fighting the emptiness, to stop running from it, and instead to sit down beside it like an old friend, to listen, to breathe, to remember that the heart has its own seasons, its own rhythms, and that life after 50 is not the end of meaning, but the beginning of a deeper, quieter kind. Emily's journey was just starting, but even in those first quiet mornings, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not the thrill of excitement, not the buzz of accomplishment, but the gentle, steady warmth of peace. And peace, as Buddhist wisdom reminds us, is not found in avoiding life, but in learning to be fully present with it, even with the emptiness. So I want to leave you with this question, one that Emily asked herself by the window, one that I invite you to carry into your own quiet moments. What if the emptiness you feel is not the absence of something you need, but the space where your heart is ready to open? Sit with that. Let it breathe inside you. And know that the journey has already begun. John Carter was 60 when the feeling caught up with him. A retired firefighter in Michigan, John had always lived a life of action. He had run into burning buildings when others ran out. He had pulled strangers from car wrecks. He had worked double shifts, missing family dinners, holidays, even his own anniversaries to serve his community. People called him a hero, shook his hand at the grocery store, thanked him for his service. But when John hung up his uniform for the last time, when the firehouse locker was empty and the radio was silent, something inside him began to stir. At first, John thought it was just boredom, so he threw himself into projects. He repainted the house twice. He built a new deck in the backyard. He took up fishing, joined a bowling league, even tried yoga at the local gym. But no matter how busy he kept himself, the evenings were the same. He would sit on the edge of his bed at night, looking at his reflection in the dark window, and feel that strange weight pressing on his chest. The world called it retirement. John called it losing himself. Buddhist wisdom teaches that there is a kind of suffering deeper than physical pain or external loss. It is the quiet restlessness that comes when we are no longer sure who we are. For decades, John had known himself as a firefighter, a protector, a man of action. Without that, he felt like a shadow walking through his own life. One evening, John was watching the sun set over the lake when his neighbor, a soft-spoken woman named Linda, joined him on the porch. She was in her 70s, with a calm presence that always seemed to settle a room. Linda poured them both a cup of tea and sat down beside him. After a long silence, she said gently, "You know, the hardest fire to put out is the one burning inside." John laughed softly, but something in those words stayed with him. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the way he had been trying to douse his own restlessness with activity. He realized that all the busy work had been his way of avoiding something he didn't want to face, the unfamiliar space inside himself. Buddhist teachings speak of the importance of sitting with what is uncomfortable. Instead of running or distracting ourselves, we are invited to stay present, to observe our experience without judgment. This is the heart of mindfulness. The next morning, instead of reaching for his project list, John poured himself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. He watched the wind ripple across the lake. He listened to the birds calling in the trees. For the first time in months, he let himself feel the emptiness instead of trying to fix it. It was not easy. His mind wanted to jump to plans, to-do lists, memories of the past. But as he kept breathing, something softened. He began to notice the details he had been missing: the play of light on the water, the rhythm of his own breath, the way the world moved without needing his constant effort. This was the beginning of a shift. The Buddha taught that clinging to identity is one of the roots of suffering. We think we are our roles, our jobs, our relationships, our accomplishments. But these are all changing, impermanent. When they fall away, we are invited to discover something deeper, a sense of self that is not tied to doing, but to being. For John, this realization came slowly. In moments of quiet, he started taking daily walks without his phone, just listening to the sound of his footsteps. He began reading books on meditation. He reached out to Linda, who introduced him to a local mindfulness group, and in these simple practices he began to reclaim a part of himself that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. There is a beautiful teaching in Buddhism that says, when we stop chasing what we think we should be, we discover who we already are. For John, this meant learning to let go of the firefighter story and open to the man underneath the uniform, the man who could sit in silence, who could feel his feelings, who could meet the world not with control, but with presence. And here is where the transformation began. One afternoon, as John sat quietly by the lake, a boy from the neighborhood ran up, breathless. "Mr. John, my bike chain broke. Can you help?" Without hesitation, John got up and knelt beside the boy, steady hands fixing the chain. But this time, something was different. He was not acting from a place of proving his worth or rescuing anyone. He was simply present, doing what needed to be done, fully there. This is the power of mindful living. You see, the restlessness after 50 is not a flaw in you. It is a natural signal that life is inviting you to shift from doing to being, from achieving to awakening. It is not a punishment. It is a doorway. John began to understand that his worth did not depend on his usefulness or his busyness. It rested in his capacity to be awake, to be kind, to be present with whoever was in front of him, including himself. If you have felt this same restlessness, I invite you to pause. Take a breath. Notice where you are right now, the sounds around you, the feeling of your body, the thoughts moving through your mind. You do not need to fix anything in this moment. You only need to be here. The journey after 50 is not about filling the emptiness with more noise. It is about listening to the quiet, and in that quiet, discovering the part of you that has been waiting for your attention all along. So I leave you with this reflection, one that John now keeps close to his heart. What if the restless ache inside you is not asking for more, but asking you to slow down and come home to yourself? Sit with that. Let it soften you, and remember you are not alone on this path. As weeks passed, John Carter found himself in a rhythm he never expected. His days were no longer packed with chores and distractions, but woven with something simpler, something that felt like breathing in a way he had never noticed before. He would sit on the porch with his coffee, just watching the sky change colors. He would walk without earbuds, letting the sound of bird song and passing footsteps keep him company. And slowly, the emptiness inside him began to soften. But here's the thing about transformation, it rarely arrives in a straight line. One afternoon, John received a phone call that shook the stillness he had been cultivating. It was his daughter Emily, calling from across the country. "Dad," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Emily was a single mom of 2, juggling a full-time job, bills, soccer practice, and school lunches. She had always been the capable one, the daughter who didn't ask for help. But now across the miles, her voice trembled with something John knew all too well, the ache of burnout, of losing touch with yourself while trying to hold everything together. In that moment, John felt the old reflex surge back, the urge to fix, to rescue, to fly across the country and take over. But something inside him paused. He remembered Linda's words. The hardest fire to put out is the one burning inside. So instead of giving advice, John did something that surprised even himself. He listened. He stayed on the phone as Emily poured out her worries. He did not interrupt, did not offer quick solution. He let her speak until the tide of her words slowed, until her breathing softened, until she let out a long, trembling sigh. "I just needed someone to hear me, Dad," she whispered. That night, John sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge, and it hit him with a kind of quiet clarity. Sometimes healing is not about doing more, but about being fully present with the people we love. Buddhist wisdom speaks of compassion, not as a heroic act, but as a way of being, to offer presence without judgment, to hold space without rushing in to fix. That is one of the most powerful gifts we can give. And this was John's turning point. He realized that all those years of firefighting had taught him to run toward crisis. But now his real task was to meet life not with a hose in hand, but with an open heart. In the weeks that followed, John became a quiet presence in his community. He showed up at the local food pantry to help sort donations, not because he needed to feel useful, but because it felt natural to offer his hands. He began meeting with a group of other retirees, gathering for morning coffee, and sharing stories of what it meant to grow older, to face loss, to find joy again. He even started a small mindfulness circle at the library, inviting neighbors to sit in silence together for 10 minutes once a week. To his surprise, the room was always full. There's a phrase in Buddhist teaching, "When the student is ready, the teacher appears." For John, the teacher had been life itself. The stillness, the emptiness, the ache that had once felt unbearable. It had called him home, not just to himself, but to the world around him. Here's the truth most of us don't hear after 50. The world doesn't need you to be a hero. It needs you to be awake. John discovered that his greatest gift was not in saving others, but in simply being present with his daughter, with his neighbors, with the man he was becoming. And as he let go of the need to fix, something beautiful happened. His relationships deepened. His laughter became softer but more genuine. His presence, once so tightly wound with purpose, became a calm space where others felt safe to be themselves. You see, the emptiness we feel after 50 is not a failure. It is an invitation to shift from achievement to connection, from doing to being, from noise to listening. And maybe that is why one evening, as John watched the sunset, Emily called again. Not in crisis this time, but just to talk. "How are you, Dad?" she asked. And John, smiling into the fading light, answered with something he never thought he would say. "I'm good, sweetheart, really good. Not because everything was fixed, not because the emptiness was gone, but because he had learned to sit with it, to breathe with it, and to let it open him to the life still unfolding before him." So I ask you now, wherever you are, whatever restlessness or ache you carry, what would it be like to stop fixing and start listening, not just to others, but to yourself, to the quiet within you that has been waiting patiently for your own attention? The heart does not need to be rescued. It needs to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, that is where true healing begins. There's a moment in every journey when you realize the path ahead is no longer about fixing the past, but about walking into something entirely new. For John Carter, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. It was raining softly outside, the kind of rain that makes you pause by the window and just watched the drops trace down the glass. John sat with his coffee, feeling the stillness of his home, noticing how the silence no longer felt heavy, but peaceful. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to fill the space with noise, no television humming in the background, no endless to-do list on the table, just the sound of rain, the warmth of his cup, and the steady beat of his own heart. This, he realized, was the beginning of his quiet revolution. Buddhist wisdom teaches that true change does not roar in like a storm. It arrives gently, like a whisper, like a breath. It happens in the smallest of moments, when we choose to meet life as it is, not as we think it should be. John began noticing how often people around him were starving for this kind of presence. At the grocery store, a cashier whose smile cracked under the weight of exhaustion. At the park, an elderly man sitting alone on a bench, eyes fixed on a memory far away. At the pharmacy, a young mother juggling a toddler and a bag of prescriptions, eyes clouded with overwhelm. And in each encounter, John began offering something deceptively simple. A moment of eye contact, a kind word, a pause that said, "I see you, you matter." He was no longer trying to change the world. He was simply trying to be in it, with open eyes, open hands, and an open heart. One day, at the local library where he had started the mindfulness circle, a woman named Sarah approached him. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a voice that trembled when she spoke. "John," she said softly, "you have no idea how much this group has meant to me. I was so lonely before this. Coming here, sitting with everyone, even in silence, it's the first time in a long time I felt like I belong somewhere." John felt his throat tighten, not out of sadness, but gratitude. He was witnessing what the Buddhist path calls interbeing, the profound truth that we are all connected, that no act of kindness is ever wasted, no matter how small. This was the real revolution, not the grand gestures, not the loud declarations, but the quiet commitment to show up again and again for ourselves and for one another. There's a teaching in Buddhism that says the world is healed one person at a time, one breath at a time. And the person we often forget to begin with is ourselves. John found that his own healing deepened as he extended compassion outward. His loneliness softened as he became a companion to others. His grief eased as he sat with the grief of those around him. It was not that he no longer missed Anna. He would always miss her, but the sharp edge of loss had worn smooth, like a stone in a river, shaped by time and tenderness. And here's the beautiful paradox. The more John opened his heart to the world, the more the world gave back. A neighbor brought over homemade bread one afternoon just because. A child on the bus handed him a drawing of a rainbow. A stranger at the coffee shop struck up a conversation, and they laughed together like old friends. John realized that emptiness was not a sign that something was wrong. It was a space waiting to be filled, with presence, with connection, with love. But not the desperate kind of love that clings or grasps, the quiet kind, the kind that says, "I am here, you are here." And that is enough. On a chilly morning in early spring, as the first buds appeared on the trees, John stood at his window and felt something stir inside him. Not the old ache of loss, but the tender pulse of aliveness. He understood now that the second half of life is not about holding on, but about letting go. Not about proving, but about being. Not about chasing, but about receiving. So if you are over 50 and you sometimes feel the ache of emptiness, know this: you are not failing. You are not broken. You are being invited into a deeper season of life. A season where your presence matters more than your accomplishments. Where your listening matters more than your answers. Where your being matters more than your doing. John's revolution was not loud, but it was real, and it changed everything. So let me ask you, what if you stopped waiting for life to get louder and started listening to the quiet? What if the healing you are looking for has been here all along, waiting in the stillness, in the ordinary moments, in the gentle rain against your window? The heart, after all, does not need to be filled with noise. It only needs to be met again and again with love. And in that meeting, something extraordinary happens. We come home, not just to the world, but to ourselves. There is something tender about coming home to yourself after years of running. It is not flashy. It is not the kind of victory that makes headlines. But in the quiet corners of the heart, it feels like a revolution. For John, the return began with small rituals. He started his mornings by opening the window. No matter the weather, he would stand there, eyes closed, feeling the cool air brush his skin. For a moment he would whisper a simple phrase to himself: "I am here." And that's enough. He didn't need to fix the past. He didn't need to figure out the future. He just needed to arrive fully in this moment. And every morning that practice reshaped him. Buddhist wisdom often speaks of coming home to the present moment, not clinging to yesterday, not worrying about tomorrow, just resting in what is here, right now. For many of us over 50, that sounds almost too simple to be true. But simple is not the same as easy, because here's the truth. Most of us have been taught to outrun our pain. We fill our days with tasks. We fill our nights with distractions. We carry the ache of emptiness like an invisible suitcase, hoping that if we just keep moving, we won't have to feel what's inside. But John had learned something most of us only discover when life finally cracks us open. That suitcase will always wait for us. And inside it is not just pain, but also our most tender longing. To feel whole, to feel seen, to feel loved. So John began to sit with that ache, not to analyze it, not to judge it, just to sit with it the way you might sit with an old friend who has been waiting for you to come home. There were days it was hard. There were mornings when grief washed over him like a wave. Memories of Anna, the years they lost, the words left unsaid. But even on those days, John kept his promise to himself. I am here, and that's enough. And over time, something softened. He found himself laughing more freely with his daughters. He found himself humming as he drove his bus through the streets of town. He found himself noticing the small moments of beauty. A bird's song at dawn, the way sunlight danced across the floor, the quiet satisfaction of a meal shared with a friend. This, John realized, was the heart of Buddhist wisdom. To be awake to life as it is, to meet the moment not with resistance, but with tenderness. To stop grasping for more, and instead open to the gift of now. But perhaps the most surprising change came not in his outer life, but in how he spoke to himself. Before, his inner voice was sharp, full of shoulds and musts and why didn't yous. But now it had become gentler. When he stumbled, he offered himself the same kindness he had learned to offer others. When he felt lonely, he placed a hand over his heart and whispered, "I am here with you." That shift, tiny but profound, changed everything. You see, many people think healing is about finally getting it right, about arriving at some perfect version of yourself where you no longer mess up or fall short. But John's story reminds us that healing is not about perfection. It's about relationship. The relationship you have with your own heart. The way you speak to yourself when no one else is listening. The tenderness you offer to the parts of you that still feel raw or broken. And here's the miracle. When you begin to offer yourself that kind of love, the world around you shifts. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. John noticed it everywhere. The neighbor who used to rush past him on the sidewalk now paused to chat. The children on the bus no longer just saw him as a driver, but as a friend. Even strangers seemed drawn to his quiet warmth. This is the magnetic pull of an open heart. It draws connection without forcing it. It invites love without demanding it. It softens the edges of loneliness and turns emptiness into spaciousness. If you have ever felt the ache of emptiness after 50, if you have ever wondered why success and stability have not filled the hollow places inside, hear this. You are not meant to be fixed. You are meant to be met with presence, with patience, with love. That is the return to self, not a return to who you were at 20 or 30 or even 40, but a return to the truth of who you are beneath all the roles and masks and striving. There is a teaching in Buddhism that says the lotus grows only in the mud. That beauty and resilience are born from the mess, not in spite of it. John came to understand that his scars were not signs of failure, but of survival. That his loneliness was not a flaw, but an invitation. That his emptiness was not a void, but a space waiting to be filled with compassion. And so, every morning, he opened the window. Every day, he made the quiet choice to return to himself. Every night he sat by the window, watching the stars appear one by one, and felt the simplest, most profound truth settle into his boat. I am here, and that's enough. So let me ask you, what would change in your life if you stopped running from yourself and started walking home? What would happen if you treated your own heart not as a problem to solve, but as a companion to cherish? The path home is not marked by grand achievements or flawless progress. It is marked by small, faithful steps, by the willingness to keep showing up, by the courage to meet yourself in the mirror and say, "You are worthy of love, just as you are." And maybe, just maybe, that is the most powerful healing of all. The sun had barely risen over the small town when John opened his window that morning. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the familiar weight on his chest. Instead, there was a quiet anticipation in the air, like something inside him had shifted. He made his coffee, stood by the window, and took in a deep breath. The smell of rain from the night before still lingered. For once, the silence wasn't lonely. It was spacious, soft, forgiving. That day, as he climbed onto his school bus, John decided to do something small but different. As the kids boarded, instead of his usual polite smile, he asked each one, "How are you today?" Some were surprised, others shy, But one by one they answered, and with every small exchange something stirred in John's heart, a realization that connection doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it's as simple as a shared moment, a kind word, or an open window. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that when we heal our own suffering, we naturally ease the suffering of others. John was beginning to understand this without needing any big ceremony or revelation. Just by softening his own heart, he had begun to soften the world around him. Later that week, John walked into the local grocery store, a place where for months he had gone in and out without much notice. But that day, the cashier, Emily, gave him a curious look and said, "You seem lighter today." And John smiled, a real smile, and said, "I think I finally opened my window." Emily chuckled, not quite understanding, but sensing something had indeed shifted. This is how transformation works after 50. It's rarely about chasing new titles, climbing mountains, or collecting new trophies. It's about removing the unnecessary weight, the invisible walls we put up, and letting the heart breathe again. Buddhist teachings remind us that we don't need to wait for perfect circumstances to feel peace. We only need to stop resisting what is here now. John realized he had spent so long waiting for the pain to disappear, waiting for some big sign that it was okay to live again. But peace had been waiting for him to stop pushing it away. At night, John found himself journaling for the first time since Anna passed. Not to write anything profound, but simply to whisper to himself on paper, "I am still here. I am still learning. I am still learning." He didn't need to have it all figured out. He just needed to keep opening the window, inside and out. The next day, Mia, the little girl from the bus, handed him another note. This time it simply said, "Thank you for smiling again." It hit John in a way that surprised him. Sometimes we underestimate how much our presence matters to others. Sometimes we don't realize that when we withdraw, we take a light from the room that people quietly miss. John understood now that healing is not about eliminating sadness. It's about making room for both joy and sadness to coexist. The Buddhist path teaches that life is full of both dark clouds and sunlight, but we suffer when we cling only to one or try to escape the other. That evening, John took a walk through the town park. He sat on a bench under the old oak tree, the same tree where he and Anna used to bring their daughters for picnics. For the first time, he noticed the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind. It was as if life was whispering, "You are part of this. You always have been." He closed his eyes and placed a hand on his heart. He thought of Anna, of his daughters, of the children on his bus, of Emily at the grocery store. He realized that his life, his presence, had a quiet but meaningful impact. He didn't need to do anything extraordinary. He just needed to be here, fully, kindly, openly. Healing after 50 is not a race to become someone new. It's an invitation to finally come home to yourself. And when you come home to yourself, you naturally become a refuge for others. John began to notice that his small acts of openness were affecting his world. The children on the bus laughed more. His neighbors stopped to chat. Even Emily at the store would share little updates about her life. It was as if, by opening his window, John had invited life to come back in. The Buddha once said, "If you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your own path." John was starting to understand this. By lighting little lamps for others, he had unknowingly brought light back into his own home. At the end of that week, John sat by his window again. This time, he wasn't waiting for the past to return or for the pain to vanish. He was simply watching the world as it was, imperfect, unpredictable, yet beautiful in its own way. And in that simple, quiet acceptance, he found a kind of peace he had been missing for a long time. If you are over 50 and feeling empty, know this: you are not broken, you are not behind, and you are not alone. Your heart is waiting patiently for you to turn toward it. It doesn't need you to fix everything. It just needs you to listen, to open, to be present. So start small. Say hello to someone. Listen without rushing. Notice the trees, the rain, the laughter you used to overlook. Sit by your own window, literally or metaphorically, and let yourself feel the wind, the light, the ordinary beauty of the moment. Your second half of life is not about proving yourself. It's about freeing yourself. It's about letting go of the unnecessary armor and stepping into your own quiet power, the power of presence, kindness, and real connection. Because when you do that, you won't just heal your own heart. You'll heal the hearts around you. And that, more than any achievement or goal, is what leaves a true mark on this world. Are you ready to open your window today? Are you ready to come home to yourself? That is where everything begins again. Let's keep walking this path together. You see, the emptiness you have been carrying is not here to break you. It's here to guide you home. It's the soft voice beneath the noise, calling you back to the present moment, back to your breath, back to the small joys that are still waiting for you. Buddhist wisdom reminds us we don't need to conquer life. We just need to meet it as it is, with an open heart. So as you move through the rest of your day, I invite you to pause. Feel the sunlight on your skin. Listen to the sound of the wind through the trees. Reach out to someone you care about. And when the ache returns, because it will, greet it like an old friend, not a problem to solve. If this journey spoke to you today, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear these words. And if you want to keep walking this path with me, make sure to subscribe and join this little community we are building together. You are not alone. You have never been alone, and today is always a beautiful day to begin again.